In the winter of 1013, two young boys, along with their mother Emma of Normandy and sister Godgifu, crossed the English Channel, sailing for Emma's homeland. They were heading for refuge with their uncle, the Duke of Normandy, Richard II, Emma's brother. These two lads were called Edward and Alfred, the sons of the embattled English king Aethelred the Unready, who had sent Edward, Alfred, Godgifu, and Emma across the Channel ahead of him. This was not Aethelred being noble and prioritizing the safety of his family above his own. No, instead it was the king testing the waters and seeing what sort of reception he may receive in Normandy if he too were to flee into exile. When Duke Richard greeted his sister, niece, and nephews with warmth, a relieved Athelred departed his kingdom, where the Vikings, led by the King of Denmark, Svein Forkbeard, were running amok, and joined his family in Normandy. For Alfred, who may well have been little more than a toddler at the time of the exile, and Edward, the banishment would be especially long. Athelred would be recalled to England a few short weeks later on the death of King Svein, and ruled over England again until his own death in 1016. Emma too would return to England after her husband's death. She would remarry to Svein's son Canute, who became sole king of England at the end of 1016 on the death of another of Athelred's sons, the noble Edmund Ironside, whilst Godgifu was married in 1024. So Alfred and Edward, in effect, had a new life and a new homeland. Their exile would last over 20 years, indeed much longer for Edward, given the tragic events of 1036, with Alfred living most of his life in Normandy. William the Conqueror would later describe Edward, known to history as Edward the Confessor, as his kinsman, due to Edward's strong familial ties with the duchy through his mother, and Athelred's forced deposition and banishment in the duchy. Naturally, William used this to bolster his flimsy claims to the English crown when he launched his invasion of 1066. But whilst Edward and Alfred may well have bonded with the Norman way of life, they still had every intention of returning to England. After all, they were the sons of a king of England and had ancient English royal blood coursing through their very veins. When Canute, a mighty and fine king, died in 1035, Edward and Alfred made preparations to return to England, with their first intention being to meet up with their mother. Canute's death, however, brought a rather sorrowful state of affairs to England. It was intended that Arthur Canute, Canute's son with Emma, would succeed him as King of England, but Canute had ruled over a vast empire, and Arthur Canute was trying to establish his authority over Denmark. It was thus decided that Harold Harefoot, Canute's son from his first marriage, would act as regent for Arthur Canute. But with Arthur Canute's arrival in England continuing to be delayed, and indeed looking increasingly unlikely, Harold Harefoot seized the crown for himself, much to Arthur Canute's disgust. In 1036, Edward and Alfred arrived in England, accompanied by many Norman knights. Naturally, this was very unwelcome news for King Harold, who knew his position on the throne was incredibly vulnerable. What came next was a violent political assassination. Travelling to meet their mother at Winchester, Edward and Alfred were ambushed by the powerful Earl Godwin, acting on behalf of the king. What followed next was particularly brutal. Florence of Worcester says that Earl Godwin put to death 600 of them, Alfred and Edward's followers, at Guildford, whilst others were mutilated by having their hands and feet cut off. Some were scalped and tortured, while still more were horrifically blinded. These were terrible scenes. Alfred was captured and put in chains, although Edward managed to escape and make it to his mother's side. Emma wisely urged him to return to Normandy, and Edward did not need telling twice. Alfred was taken to Ely by ship, but before he had even disembarked, he too had his eyes savagely put out. Alfred was left in the charge of some local monks, and he would spend a few more days clinging to life at their monastery before he eventually expired. Alfred's fate was cruel. Harold Harefoot, a useless king and an even more useless man, would have deemed his actions necessary to cling on to the crown that he had stolen. Alfred and Edward, it would have appeared to Harold, were plotting to take the crown back into English hands. But were they? Yes, they had arrived with an armed retinue in England, but Harthacnut, who should have been King of England at that time, had a good relationship with his half brother Edward, and he was outraged at his other half brother's, Alfred's, murder. If he felt that Edward and Alfred were plotting to take his crown, albeit from Harold, surely Harthacnut wouldn't have been trusting enough to invite Edward back to England as soon as Harthacnut finally took the English crown in 1040. Another point to consider is how did this affect Edward's attitude to Earl Godwin, a man he must have resented. The Earl's son, Harold, of course, succeeded Edward the Confessor in January 1066, but did Edward really want that? One theory for Edward not having children was that, being married to Godwin's daughter, Edward wished to spite the mighty Earl and not allow the powerful Godwin family to take the throne. If that theory was true, Harold Godwinson had either manipulated the old king to make him his heir, or more likely, given the swiftness of Harold's actions, Godwinson felt secure enough in his power to have himself crowned, entirely unbothered by not having Edward's approval. After all, Edward was now dead, so what did it matter?